Growing up in the area, we would drive by Camp Stanton frequently, and we had no idea that the history we would learn later came from that little small area in Benedict, Maryland, which we now know was Camp Stanton.
It wasn't just about the Union soldiers at Camp Stanton, but the hundreds and hundreds of runaway slaves who went to Camp Stanton to seek help and hoping that Uncle Sam would grant them what they wanted, which was freedom.
Telling the story of Camp Stanton is important because it's American history. Overall, it's our history. It's history that needs to be known, especially in the African American community, because it has never been widely spoken about. It hasn't been widely put into the history book, but there's so much history in this area, and Camp Stanton is full of it. And if you go out to the area now, it is still the same as it was back in the 1800s.
You have to know the background of what was going on here in Charles County to understand the significance of this Union camp called Camp Stanton, named after Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Lincoln in 1863, starting in January, declared that all enslaved people would be free in the states that were in rebellion against the Union. Maryland did not secede. So Maryland was not in rebellion against the Union, but yet it was a slave state. When the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, the politicians from Southern Maryland, and including Charles County, contacted the Lincoln administration and said, now wait a minute, that doesn't free the slaves in Maryland. And of course, President Lincoln was very concerned about losing the state of Maryland. He didn't want the state of Maryland to secede. So he handled the plantation owners with kid gloves and said, oh, don't worry, we are not going to free the slaves in Maryland, including Charles County. Finally, in May of 1863, the North had lost so many white soldiers in battle, through disease or through battle, that they needed more soldiers. And the abolitionist elements in the North had been pressing all along to allow freed slaves or runaway slaves to become Union soldiers. So Lincoln was caught between a rock and a hard place. More and more there was pressure here in Southern Maryland with slaves running off to Washington, D.C. or wherever they could get to join the Union Army, and the Union Army wasn't accepting them. So finally in May of 1863, the decision was made that if you were a slave owner and if you had not been disloyal in any way, and if you gave your permission, your slaves would be allowed to join the Union Army. Well, that didn't last very long because there were so many Union officers who were from, let's say, New England, places where there was a strong abolitionist sentiment. They were going to take any African American at all that came into camp, regardless of whether they were from a loyal plantation owner or not. So it got out of hand, and Lincoln just let it go because the wave was too strong now to stop this from happening. So a camp was formed here in Southern Maryland in October of 1863. Among the 4 regiments, there was the 7th USCT, the 9th, the 19th, and the 30th. The Union soldiers selected Benedict as the site for their camp, the United States Colored Troop Camp, because it was an ideal spot to land ships and take ships out to recruit other soldiers. So it was a great recruitment spot. Docks were already there, ready to go. The water is deep enough at Benedict for ships to come in and out, including steamers. That was equivalent to a major highway that led to the Chesapeake, which led to other tributaries, and eventually out to the Atlantic Ocean and points south. So it was an ideal spot for the camp to be located. Also, it was located there because Southern sympathies were so strong in Southern Maryland, a Union presence here they felt would squelch anti-Union actions, pro-Southern activities. Camp Stanton was a Union training center for runaway slaves and free blacks who wanted to be in the Union Army. So they were inducted there, and they were trained there for combat. And that lasted from October 63 to March 64. By that time, the training had been completed, and they were ready to be integrated into the regular U.S. Army that was already out in the field.
I couldn't tell how long I stayed at Camp Stanton. We had our winter quarters there. I was a private soldier, didn't do anything outside of my duties as a soldier, carried my musket from beginning to end. When we left Benedict in the spring, we came to Baltimore and went into Camp Belger. The 19th Regiment was the only regiment at Benedict while we were there. Private James Brooks.
I was born in Charles County, Maryland. I was born enslaved to Washington Hussey. Now I ran away from my master when I was 21 years old and went to a place called Benedict, Maryland, and enlisted in Company K in the 19th Colored Infantry. We was known as the U.S. Colored Volunteers. We camped in Benedict until we was ready to go to Baltimore, Maryland. Corporal Molly Fenwick.
It's hard to envision what the campsite looked like. There are very few photographs, so we only know what was written, and there are not many written accounts of what happened here. One of the officers, a Colonel Armstrong of the 9th, he did write quite a bit about his experiences here, so I've gleaned a lot of information from Colonel Armstrong's reports.
Samuel Chapman Armstrong was a Union soldier who took the task of educating Black soldiers at Camp Stanton. When they were looking for soldiers to command the Black regiments, he actually volunteered, and he started out commanding the 9th Regiment. So when the war ended, he joined the Fredmans Bureau, and then eventually got money from the American Missionaries Association, and that money he took and started what we know today as Hampton University.
Since entering this branch of the service, I have felt the high duty and sacredness of my position. It is no sacrifice for me to be here. It is rather a glorious opportunity, and I would be nowhere else than here if I could, and nothing else than an officer of colored troops if I could. This content, this almost supreme satisfaction, has shed a rich glow upon my life. I have felt and do feel like a very apostle of human liberty striking the deadliest possible blow at oppression. And what duty is more glorious than that? Colonel Samuel Chapman Armstrong.
There were also 5 ladies from Massachusetts who had been invited by the Fredmans Bureau. This was a new bureau created by the United States government to address the needs of freed slaves. They were invited to come to Camp Stanton by General Birney. General Birney was the U.S. general in charge of Camp Stanton. And these ladies were invited to come to teach their ABCs, literacy, to the slaves. These ladies came, 2 from Boston, 3 from Billerica, Massachusetts. The 3 from Billerica, Massachusetts were cousins, and thank goodness they kept diaries.
January 22nd. Our school met from 10 to 12. Such eagerness to learn you can hardly understand, nor the surprising facility of some. They come in by companies, but it is so sad to think of their condition. January 23rd, went to school at 8 o'clock. Should have enjoyed it very much if we could have had books. The poor fellows seem so disappointed, and it is no easy task to teach 100 men from 2 or 3 cards. The labor in itself is exhausting, and the consciousness that one must leave so much undone is still more so. Elizabeth Rogers.
One of the most famous battles in the Civil War was the battle that was fought near Petersburg, Virginia, called the Battle of the Crater. The men in the 19th USCT and the 30th USCT found themselves in one of the most infamous battles of the Civil War. Once they left Camp Stanton, they found themselves fighting the Confederates, and in this particular instance, the Confederates were in defensive lines all around the southern side of the city of Petersburg to prevent the North from taking Richmond. They had to get through Petersburg first. So these defensive lines were very difficult for the Union to break through. So some Pennsylvania coal miners came up with the idea that they would dig a tunnel under the Confederate lines, pack it with explosives, set it off, and blow a hole through the Confederate lines, and then the Union soldiers would rush through the hole and break the defense, and then would be able to take the town of Petersburg. So this occurred, the explosion went off, it was a tremendous sized crater. Confederates were blown up in the air. It was a perfect opportunity for Union forces to flood in. So among the Union forces that flooded into the crater and along the sides were the 19th and the 30th UCT. Well, so many men rushed into this crater, and the crater had steep sides, maybe 15 feet tall. They got in there, and they were so packed together that they had a difficult time aiming their rifles. Once the dust settled, the Confederates ran back to this huge hole and lined up along the rim of the crater and started firing down into the crater. So as men from the 19th and the 30th tried to get out of the crater and climb up the sides, they were clubbed, stabbed with bayonets, shot. Even the Confederate artillery zeroed in on the crater and fired artillery into the crater. So many Charles County soldiers who had been slaves found themselves in one of the most dangerous spots of the Civil War. And quite a few were killed and wounded in that battle.
My name is Jerome Spears. My ancestor is Daniel Gant. He was a U.S. colored troop, mustered at Camp Stanton in the Civil War.
My name is Anthony Needham. I'm a direct male descendant of Levin Logan. He was a sergeant in the 9th Regiment, and he trained at Camp Stanton. He was from Accomack County, Virginia, on Virginia's Eastern Shore. My great-great-grandfather was born free in Accomack County somewhere around 1845. His parents, his mother and his grandparents were owned by a Major Oliver Logan on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, somewhere in Accomack County. And when Oliver Logan died, he gave them their freedom. So Levin was born free on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. He came to Camp Stanton, it was November 1863, and I think he was here until the camp was probably closed. I don't know much about his time at Camp Stanton, but right after that, the 9th Regiment went to South Carolina. There were some things that were going on there. And then maybe a year later, they moved into the Richmond, Virginia area. And they spent a lot of time in that whole Richmond, Virginia area during the Petersburg-Richmond campaign.
Daniel Gant was my second great-grandfather on my father's side. He was my grandmother's grandfather. I think he mustered in 1863. So he would have been in service 1863, 1864, and then by 1865, when General Lee was, he was losing and he was retreating, and I think he ended up in the Petersburg area where that last battle with Grant happened. My understanding is that they used some of the colored troops to place them in position, not necessarily to fight, but just to deny terrain from Lee as he's trying to retreat or maneuver or get away. So, we can't go there, those colored troops are there, we gotta go this way, or we gotta go that way and face Grant. So, as I understand it, the troops were used for blocking purposes. And of course, if you're there, you're there and you're laying in the mud with just a gun pointing in the darkness, and mosquitoes are getting you, so now, okay, Lee hasn't fired a shot, but you're laying there getting eaten by mosquitoes, and next you know, they're carting you off to the hospital because you're now getting disease just sitting there, doing your job, holding that terrain. But the mosquitoes had a vote in that fight too, and they just started biting and doing what they do, and before you know it, half these guys are getting carted back to the back lines because they were getting sick from disease. So my understanding was that he was in the Petersburg area when he got sick. That's probably 1864, maybe early 1865, right, as we get near the end of the war. And they caught him off to the hospital at Norfolk. where he's there for maybe a month or so before he dies. And he dies, I forget exactly when he dies, but I think he dies maybe around April, which is, I think, when the end of the Civil War happened. So, he loses his life right as the North is winning the war. And if he could have not gotten sick, maybe he could get to come back home, reunite with his wife and the kids and the whole bit. That's what it meant to be for him.
For a free man to go fight in a war, I believe he was fighting for the freedom of his friends, people. In Accomack County, even as a free man, he was obviously seeing my great-great-grandmother before he left, and she was a slave. And so when you think about that, he's free, he's going on somebody's property to visit someone that's enslaved. I think he would really want to see that person free, and to know that he's having his children and other friends that he knows would be free. So I really think he came as a freedom fighter. And that's what I tell my children. That's what I tell my cousins, that, you're the descendants of a true freedom fighter. A man that, put it all on the line as a free man. He really didn't have to go. He was a free man. And that's what's important to me, that we're descendants of a freedom fighter. And I would hope that my children will have something and we can document this. And that in the world we live in, there's so many things that, can be discouraging. And it looks like, why should I keep going? But here is a man that, against the odds, just, came from Virginia to Maryland, fought in major battles in the Civil War, and went back to greet his bride-to-be, now a free woman.
One of the important things from Camp Stanton is Hampton University. If anything came out of that, that is what's important. Hampton University. Also, that not only did Armstrong want to educate African Americans, he also wanted to educate Native Americans as well. And I just, you can't ask for anything better than that, especially during that time. Samuel Chapman Armstrong. So he was always pushing to help, push Black people forward, Native Americans forward, and just took a special interest in also wanting to include them in society. I guess that's what I could say came out of Camp Stanton. One man, it can start, even though it was one man, it was a lot.
We've got to remember places like Camp Stanton. Studying Camp Stanton is a microcosm of the whole Civil War. When you really study what was happening there and what that was all about. It was a clash of cultures, a clash of those who owned others, and a clash between those who wanted to be free, and that section of free African Americans who were willing, they didn't have to fight, willing to sacrifice their lives for others who weren't free. So to me, it's a study in humanity, and it's probably one of the best studies of all Charles County history that we could do if we really want to know about humanity and what was happening here. And then nothing's happened like that since. Nothing happened like that before. We had the American Revolution, and we have connections with what happened in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812 here in Southern Maryland, but nothing compares with what happened here at Camp Stanton during that time period and what it represented for everyone.